Aside from a gust of wind that played through the gardens outside the window, not a sound could be heard. Countess Jesn looked up from the parchment she had placed on the dais, slowly running her gaze over the assembled nobles. As no one spoke, she looked back down and continued. The next item is THWW wait. A woman's voice stammered out unsteadily from a corner of the chamber. That's it? The Empire, reduced to a point on our agenda? There were several details accompanying the announcement, Countess Jesn replied offhandedly, but our esteemed assembly appeared entirely uninterested. Then how? A noble rose from his seat. Why? Didn't the Empire endorse His Majesty's claim to this duchy? Were they not allies? When did the Sorcerer King mobilize his armies? Asked another. If there was some sort of conflict, we should have seen signs of it from here. The closest city of the Empire may be 3 days away, but their towns and villages come all the way to the borders of the Sorceress Kingdom, as do ours to the Empire. There was no smoke or any sign of devastation, no flocks to follow after carrion. If the Sorcerer King turned on his ally, what sort of trust can be placed in him? Is the His Majesty's word so easily broken? Are we next? If His Majesty had any such designs, do you think the royal court would have informed us? Countess Jesn scoffed at the last noblewoman's fearful speculation. After all of their efforts to create all these new administrative systems and security measures, perhaps you should more carefully consider your words before you blurt them out like some ignorant, drunken vagrant. The assembly settled down again with the Countess' reprimand. It was the Empire that initiated the process, she told them. The bloody Emperor himself, according to the Guardian Overseer. Ludmilla had heard the previous evening that the Sorcerer King had visited the Empire at some point to make his offer to the prospective adventurers there, but there had been nothing regarding what had been announced to the House of Lords. What is the nature of this new relationship, then? Clara asked calmly from beside her. You say client state, but are they a vassal? A tributary? The terms that define the new relationship have been drafted internally by the royal court, pending His Majesty's final approval. Countess Jesn paused for a moment before speaking again. As is, the Baharuth Empire will not become a vassal in the same sense that the nobles of Eranthal are His Majesty's vassals. If I were to use a word to describe the arrangement, it would be that they have entered under the hegemony of the Sorceress Kingdom as a protectorate. Minor details aside, they will enjoy the same autonomy as they currently do as an independent state, save for the recognition of the executive authority of their suzerain in matters where it is deemed necessary. A concerned murmur filled the hall again. It was an extraordinarily open-ended term, one that put the Empire entirely at the mercy of the Sorceress Kingdom. Ludmilla knew well enough that, if the relationship remained a benign one, it offered many benefits. If it turned sour, however, the royal court of the Sorceress Kingdom could instruct the Empire to slaughter its own population and raze their own nation to the ground, and the Empire would be legally bound to do so. At least the nobles of Eranthal, under the adopted laws of Riestais, were granted protection from acts of tyranny and were involved in the legislative process of the realm. Well, on paper, anyways. If the Sorcerer King decided to turn against his own nobility, there was nothing they could really do. In a way, the arrangement might be considered somewhat similar. Survival was contingent on the grace of their liege. As a noble, however, it was hard to imagine such a blatant breach of trust, and it was that very trust that allowed them to administer the fiefs without worry. She wondered why there was such a marked difference in treatment. Was there something unsatisfactory about the Sorceress Kingdom's current laws for the Empire to be handed such double-edged terms? This information has not been made publicly available yet. Countess Jesn closed the topic after the continued questions from the members of the Assembly had finally been spent. The royal court has seen fit to share this with the House of Lords so that we may make preparations in advance of this development. The royal capital is to be the crown jewel of the Sorceress Kingdom, and as constituents of the capital duchy we must do our utmost in support of the policies that have been laid out by the royal court to achieve this before formal relations with the Empire are opened. The remaining points on Countess Jesn's agenda mostly outlined these new policies, and the assembly dispersed a little before noon, with many of the nobles dividing into groups to digest the presented information over lunch. Ludmilla and Clara left together as they had entered, but were joined shortly along the way to Lady Corlin's guest manor by two other noblewomen, Baroness Florine Cadia Dale Gonnier and Baroness Liane Loretta Dale Wagner. Baroness Wagner's fief was immediately east of Erantl's city limits, running along the south of the highway between Erantl and the Empire. Vintner Barony formally separated her territory from Corlin Barony, so Countess Corlin had essentially become her new neighbor. In addition to raising horses and other draft animals, House Wagner owned a half-dozen merchant companies whose primary routes lay between Reisteis and the Empire. The brief conflict and the following annexation of Erantl had disrupted their operations, but, with the Empire becoming a client state of the Sorceress Kingdom, the path would become free of hindrances to trade in that direction. Baroness Gonier's fief was also adjacent to Erantl, and lay on Wagner's northern border across the highway to the Empire. Her territory was focused on producing food for Erantl, and one of the primary sources of dairy and poultry products delivered to the city. Both Wagner and Gonier made their homes in the city itself, administering their fiefs from family manors in the central district. With Countess Corlin's rise to prominence, it was a matter of political and economic necessity for the neighboring Wagner to draw close to her. Mostly because she was Wagner's friend, but also because she didn't want to be left out alone against the new camp that had formed overnight in the eastern portion of the duchy. Gonier had joined the group as well. Though it might have seemed a cold, calculating thing, it was a reality born from generations of noble politics, and they had come together rather naturally due to this. When Erantl was still a part of Reisteis, the women of the duchy had nominally amicable relationships working behind the scenes to influence the direction of the domain, so there was little in the way of past hostilities that would deter them from banding together in any case. The small party of young noblewomen chatted amiably while strolling through sunlit blossoms of the royal villa's gardens, followed by their ladies' maids. Gazing upon this picturesque scene, one would have never suspected that they were all subject to the rule of an undead sovereign. They arrived at Countess Corlin's guest manor, where she was hosting lunch, and were led to a dining room similar in appearance to the one that Ludmilla had in her own city residence. Rather than the beeswax candles and their silver stands, however, intricately fashioned magical lamps shone over the long mahogany dining table. The heavy drapes of the dining room had been drawn to block the glare of the midday sun, and the polished silverware laid across the table glowed in the warm light. Florian Gonier and Leanne Wagner were seated on their host's left, while Ludmilla was seated on Clara's right. Ludmilla knew why she was probably seated there, being close friends with Clara since childhood, but the idea that she held only a tiny fraction of the wealth and influence of the other three noblewomen made her feel undeserving of the arrangement. Her eyes went to Wagner and Gonier, hoping that she wouldn't detect any traces of disdain or affront. The two city nobles had a distinctly different aura than Clara and herself, who mostly administered from within their rural territories. Like Clara, they had the shades of blonde hair that were common to much of Reisteis' nobility, but they did not have the same strict and formal appearance. Instead, they wore light, long-sleeved blouses with simple flowing skirts that hovered just above their calves. Rather than boots for rough, rural locales, they wore polished leather shoes meant for city use. The clothing emulated the urban fashions of the city popular with the citizenry, but the exquisite tailoring and fine fabrics of their garments distinguished them with an elegant look. They settled into their seats and quietly waited for the meal to begin. Behind closed doors, nobles would switch to discussing more serious and sensitive topics, but they started on their entree in silence. Unused to leading conversations and being naturally shy, Ludmilla thought she would have to kick her friend under the table to get things going. Fortunately, by the time they had reached their second course, a consommé garnished with fresh garden herbs from her nearby fief, Clara realized she was being a poor host and visibly worked up the courage to speak. "So, about the Empire." Her voice carried a great degree of hesitation, but it was clearly the topic of the day. Throughout the remainder of the assembly, even as Countess Jesn went through the remainder of the subjects delivered from the royal court, the fate of the Empire had clearly dominated the thoughts of all in attendance. Out of nowhere, wasn't it? Baroness Gonier's amber eyes sparkled animatedly as she picked up on Clara's cue in her dulcet tones. Both Wagner and I received absolutely no reports on any activity along the borders. I wonder how His Majesty managed such a feat. Well, I for one, am relieved. Baroness Wagner's icy blue eyes expressed disinterest in the how of things and her slightly lower voice was frank. My merchants have been dealing with all sorts of nonsense in the Empire for over a month. From the few couriers that came in to report last week, their business has been poor, hampered by the very idea that they were associated with the Sorceress Kingdom. Hampered how? Was anyone hurt? Clara's spoon paused as her voice turned to concern. Those caravans haven't even been back to the duchy since autumn, have they? There haven't been any injuries, nor any sort of overt harassment, really? Baroness Wagner replied, but it was such an openly huge event that the rumors flew on wings faster than a hippogriff. Within a few days of Katza, the news was all over our winter, and all over the Empire by the end of the week. Fear has a way of making people lose their minds. It didn't matter that they had been in the Empire the entire time. Ludmilla saw the three other faces at the table grimace at the words. It was not too long ago that Erantel had cowered in the shadow of a similar fear, so they all knew its effects firsthand. The entire duchy was now desperately working to make up for lost time, and the new policies to improve the capital region pressed them all the more. It wasn't as bad as it was here, was it? Gonye asked. Of course not, Wagner sniffed. It was just a general avoidance of my merchants and a variety of silly rumors surrounding them. People would think they were necromancers in disguise, selling cursed goods, or being undead themselves. For anyone to actually bring harm to our caravans, well, they would have to have been living under a rock this entire time. They might not attack our merchants, Gonye's voice pressed lightly, but it still doesn't solve the problem. If our goods come with a stigma, exports will suffer. Perhaps the royal court can do something about it? Those absurdly vague terms that the emperor agreed to pretty much means that the empire can be ordered to do anything at all. I wonder what His Majesty did to break him to such a degree that he would concede such authority. The women exchanged looks with one another. That was the million platinum question. Jerkniv Runefar Lord Elnex, the bloody emperor, was a rising star, even in the eyes of those not belonging to the empire. Possessed of great intellect, charisma and the imperial bloodline of Baharuth, he had ambition to match, seeing a meteoric rise to power through his shrewd and decisive actions to consolidate power and reform the nation's administration. No one could question that he would inevitably become a preeminent force in the politics of the region, nor could anyone imagine that he would submit to anyone, never mind agree to such disadvantageous terms. Perhaps he feared what would happen otherwise? Ludmilla offered. It could have been a tactic to intimidate him into compliance by presenting an unthinkable alternative. Across from her, both Wagner and Gonye stopped to stare at her, utensils resting limply in their soup. Scary, said Wagner. Scary. Gonye was aghast. What? Ludmilla had no idea why they had reacted that way. They were like two peas in a pod. Frontier nobles are scary, Clara agreed. Is this how she deals with dummy humans? Gonye's small voice was tinged with worry. Threaten them with unfathomably horrible things to keep them away from the border? I suppose that this is at least partially true. Well, a few usually need to die before we get any results, but... The others seemed to have read Ludmilla's thoughts perfectly. Baroness Aradnik, Gonye's voice seemed a bit shaky. I understand that you followers of the six great gods don't really get along with demi-humans, but the Empire is full of humans, you know. These terms are something only a devil would force upon them. I could understand if it was negotiating over the price of goods, Wagner agreed, but this is the fate of an entire nation for the indeterminate future we're talking about here. She didn't think it was that bad of a strategy, but the two newcomers seemed to have developed a rather harsh image of her. Ludmilla looked over to Clara for support. The Countess was focusing on the slices of roast duck in the main course. When their eyes met, Clara's innocently shifted away. Then would you petition the royal court to amend these terms? Ludmilla asked. There's no reason for that, is there? Gonye's tone became somewhat indifferent. We're nobles of the nation that holds the advantage with these terms, after all. It was just some idle speculation over what had happened in the Empire. Unless the Empire's affairs infringe upon our own, there's no reason to voice any complaint. The irrational thoughts about our exports should blow away soon, I think, Wagner said as her friend turned her attention to the meal. We've all seen the projections. There is no way anyone in the region can compete with our production costs. Even after a significant markup, it still handily outstrips any alternative. Practicality will triumph over such unfounded superstition, yes? Speaking of the projections, Clara spoke, having finished her duck. What will you do about your domain, Liane? They all looked at Baroness Wagner, whose lips had drawn into a thin line at the question. Out of the four nobles, Liane's domain had the greatest exposure to risk from the changing markets. Ludmilla still had nearly her entire barony to grow into, while Clara, well, the entire duchy would have to fall into ruin before Clara could, probably not even then. Garnier's industries would see direct benefits relative to the cheap cost of fodder. Wagner, whose domain provided draft animals for the local markets, would have to deal with the gradual adoption of undead throughout the duchy. Eventually, no one in the Sorceress Kingdom would use draft animals over powerful, tireless undead workers who could do far more work for a fraction of the cost. "It's not that bad, I think," Wagner replied after taking a sip of wine. "It is true that the demand for draft animals will likely diminish to nothing in local markets in due time, but the demand for them will increase for drawing goods to foreign markets. If the need for horses and oxen triples or quadruples due to the increase in exports and trade overall, there shouldn't be that great of a shortfall. There should be an accompanying demand for wainwrights, so I can start encouraging apprenticeships in that direction to expand associated industries, and of course the trade networks of our companies should see substantial growth. Our animals are among the best in the region, so there should be no issues there either. Demand for them abroad was always greater than in the duchy, anyways." Though what she said made sense, her voice was still tenuous. Nobles that had already heavily invested in developing their lands to best suit the former economic balance of Erantle faced a great amount of uncertainty when it came to reorganizing their industries and populations. Even when the choices seemed sound in theory, the specter of doubt always shadowed them in lieu of actual results. Potentially devastating costs accompanied any poor decisions, to both the nobles and their subjects, yet there was no choice but to forge ahead, for staying as they were would surely mean ruin. A somber atmosphere settled over the table. Each member at the table had a sense of what Lady Wagner was going through. They all had no expectation of inheriting the titles which they now held, and certainly not at this age. Clara and Ludmilla were 17, while Wagner was 15 and Garnier a year younger. The legacy of their houses and responsibility for tens of thousands of people had suddenly been thrust upon them, when just months before they had been preparing to become suitable wives for their future husbands. Their families were gone and they had little in the way of confidants or friends they could rely on. There was no time to grieve or wallow in self-pity over having their world turned upside down. They needed to stand and move forward as the heads of their respective houses. No one else would do it for them. Clara reached out to lightly place her hand onto Wagner's wrist, who had ceased eating entirely, with a troubled expression on her face. "Don't worry, Leanne," she said in a reassuring voice. "We'll be here for you if anything goes wrong." "Thank you," Wagner sniffed and wiped her eyes with her free hand, brightening somewhat. "I don't think the worst could come to pass, but it is still a relief to know that I have everyone's support." Between the group of nobles having lunch together, they could most likely hold through any but the most dire of crises. Their little camp had come about somewhat haphazardly on its own, but it appeared to be surprisingly sturdy nonetheless. Somewhere in the house, the chime of a clock could be heard, and Amelia stirred from the wall, entering into the edge of her vision. "My lady," she said softly to Ludmilla. "Apologies for interrupting your meal, but your appointment with the Adventurer Guild awaits." The tall grass rustled with the passing of many feet as the contingent of adventurers made their way around the city wall. Once occupied by thick clumps of trees and brush, the cover that had been foolishly allowed to grow all the way to the curtain wall in the past had been cleared away. In its place lay an open field that stretched out in a 3-kilometer radius all around the city of Erantle. Itzal mused over the change. Lord Rettenmuir, the previous mayor of the city, might have been an excellent civil administrator, but he was blind when it came to even basic security matters. He supposed it was proof that even capable individuals could still be unbelievably inept when it came to matters outside of their own expertise. Personally, the idea that the agents of the Sorceress Kingdom were a bit more competent than those of Erantle's former administration was not something he liked to see. On the bright side, it showed that the inhuman forces occupying the city still adhered to common principles and logic, thus possessing a predictability that could be exploited. Despite the terrain being leveled and cleared of obstacles, they moved at a relatively slow pace. Well, it was a slower pace than he was capable of. As they were undergoing adventurer training whatever that meant, the groups had a wide range of ranks represented in each. There were the 4 members of a mithril-ranked adventurer team that headed each of their respective groups. A platinum and a gold rank led the remaining 2 teams. The ground that an adventurer party could cover was generally determined by the slowest member of the party, and traditional parties were generally composed of equally ranked members. Mithril teams could traverse vast distances compared to silver teams in the same amount of time, and silver teams would outpace copper teams. As each training team had at least 2 copper ranks each, with at least one of them being a mage of some sort, every team could only move at the pace of a copper-ranked mage. It was a wildly impractical setup if it were to be applied outside of training, but, since it was training, it allowed the higher-ranked adventurers to serve as mentors to their juniors. That was the stated idea, anyways, but Itzal had severe doubts about the whole thing. The mixing of ranks was not the only aspect that was wildly different. If anything, it might be considered reasonable given the circumstances. There were far more drastic changes that came with this new adventurer guild. Foremost was the number of members in a party. A traditional adventurer party was composed of 4 members, but the new organization had expanded that number to 6. In addition, each party was a member of a larger expeditionary contingent composed of a maximum of 36 members. Only 30 positions, 5 teams, would be filled in regular operations. The last group would only join the expedition in extraordinary circumstances that required additional considerations, such as greater diplomatic acumen, economic expertise or physical and magical might. It was an arbitrary number decided upon by the coordinators from the Sorceress Kingdom, and, when a few asked for the reason why, the only response was that it was the correct way to do things. As he slowly jogged along while pointedly attempting to ignore the wheezing of the copper-plate mage behind him, Itzal supposed that the new formation also had its benefits. The traditional 4-member formation of an adventurer team was composed of a defender, vanguard, healer and a class that could act as a center guard, usually a caster who shored up a common deficit in magical offense. This was generally perceived as well-balanced for the types of work adventurers did, though variations of an adventurer formation and its numbers were not uncommon. The 2 positions added were that of a dedicated scout, and a variable position that served multiple roles or could be swapped depending on the expectations of the party's work in any given environment. On that note, adventurer teams were no longer fixed, they were now fluid groups whose compositions could be reconfigured according to the demands of their tasks and the availability of members. The scout's role was clear enough as parties often utilized them, performing double duty in another role. With the new mandate of the Adventurer Guild, they would serve as trailblazers, trackers and survival experts out in the vast unknown that their parties were sent out to explore. Rogues and rangers, who usually occupied a vanguard or center guard position, had been mostly assigned to the scout positions. Rangers were adept at navigating and surviving in the wilderness, while rogues were extremely useful in exploring dangerous ruins. Both excelled in reconnaissance. Bards could also fill the scout position, but, as there was currently an abundance of rangers and rogues, the few bards present occupied the latter variable position as wildcards due to their broad skill sets and magical utility. Admittedly, the newly prescribed 6-member party was more resilient and adaptable, but one could say that adding anything to an already small party would make it so. There was one more, major, change that might have been seen as a reason for the increase in standard party size. Each 6-member party was also required to have a sort of diplomat, or a commissary, depending on how one thought about it, a member that was well versed with the foreign policy of the Sorceress Kingdom, practiced in law and diplomacy, and would ensure that the collective understanding and behavior of the party did not misrepresent the mandate of their organization and thus reflect badly on the nation's image. It was not a role that was required in the vast majority of requests adventurers normally took. One did not need a negotiator when exterminating monsters, or be mindful of public image and property rights when ransacking ruins and collecting rare materials. After all, it was a markedly difficult position to fill with the Adventurer Guild's current membership. Amongst those present, it was mostly the bards who were closest to fitting the bill. Itzal supposed that if it were a human nation, clerics and paladins with such inclinations could also perform in this capacity. As it was, there was only one cleric in the guild present here, who did not meet the qualifications anyways, and so they had to turn to unconventional choices to fill the last couple of openings. Those vocations normally associated with such matters were by and large civilian occupations. Since each member of a party was also required to be a proficient combatant capable of surviving hostile scenarios, they could not simply recruit an office worker for the position. The first individual who had volunteered was actually a veteran of the city militia, who at least had experience dealing with a wide variety of people from abroad and was somewhat familiar with local laws. He had decided that, With all of the powerful undead sentries employed by the Sorceress Kingdom in the city, he could be better put to use elsewhere and was now studying to fully qualify for his new career as a diplomatic representative working for the Adventurer Guild. The second person that had shown up was a young noblewoman, who had become the personification of all his frustrations with the former subjects of Ria's ties. Itzal's initial assessment about the future course of the duchy was that its economy would eventually encounter issues related to the huge portions of its rural population fleeing its lands. Since cities existed to service the regions that they lay within, the collapse of rural industries would result in the collapse of the city's industries, causing the situation to rapidly deteriorate into intense hardship and unrest. It never happened, however. Erantle only ever seemed to gain in momentum on every front as the weeks went by. It did not take long for realization over what was happening to dawn upon him. Most of the citizens were actually collaborating with their new overlord, though they probably did not even think of it in those terms. The people just resumed their lives, fueling activity which would ultimately benefit the Sorcerer King in whatever schemes he had set into motion. The nobility, however, was playing an active role. He did not know how it had started, but eventually every noble had fallen in line with the inhuman administration, playing their part in the realm's governance. Many had started to adopt undead labor to varying degrees in the territories under their management, which shored up the shortfalls in manpower that would have otherwise spelled doom for the city. He had known since the previous spring that his superiors had a plainly poor assessment of Ria's ties' leadership and had turned to favor the Empire instead, but it was not until it had come to this point that he truly understood the depths of depravity that they had fallen to. That they would be willing to subordinate themselves to an evil monster and spread the undead to all corners of the region just to maintain their wealth and power was absolutely disgusting. Their moral corruption knew no bounds. He had nearly emptied his stomach in the street upon piecing together the truth. In a word, it was bad. Nearly everything about the situation in the city was bad. The people were being blithely led to embrace their monstrous sovereign by greedy and corrupt nobles, sellouts and traitors to humanity. The local Adventurer Guild, formerly an organization that served as a shield of the people, was now being repurposed into an expeditionary force. Who knows at what point they would be turned against their neighbors. All it would take was for them to engineer a singular incident, and the armies of the Sorceress Kingdom would have a convenient excuse to devastate a nation. Erantle had become a pit of hell, disguised as a fragrant blossom which lay out its insidious tendrils across the land to drain the life out of everything it touched. It would continue to grow until it had a stranglehold on the entire region and, from there, it would wither away the entire world. Itzal thanked the gods that he could see what was happening here. His reports would filter out to the theocracy, who must surely do something to counter this great scourge that had appeared before the nations. He only prayed that a solution was devised before too many innocent lives were exposed to the suffering that would surely come with the Sorceress Kingdom's heinous actions. But not these people. These people could burn along with their accursed king. The adventurers in front of him slowed their pace. Itzal looked around at their surroundings, then up at the sun above. They had made their way out of the city gate a little over an hour ago, circling around the city walls to the northwest. At some point, they had straightened their course and slowly distanced themselves from Erantle. The city's massive walls could still be seen looming to the east, but they had traveled quite a ways. The contingent of adventurers entered what appeared to be a standing ruin hidden in a wooded meadow, with weathered pillars and piles of stone strewn about. In the center of ruin was an old-looking structure with a darkened, rectangular entrance. Itzal furrowed his brow. This close to the city, any ruins would have been picked clean and the structures repurposed into useful building materials by generations long past. Before he could think too much on it, a trio of figures appeared from the entrance of the ruin. Sighs were drawn from the assembled adventurers as the first came into the light. Dressed in an extravagant gown the likes of which Itzal had never seen before, she was a pale, voluptuous girl in the cusp of adolescence. Her porcelain skin shielded from the harsh light of the sun by a dark parasol, she came forward with a seductive, swaying motion accentuated by her voluminous skirts. The two following after her were a pair of elf children, twins, going by their close appearance. One was a boy in sturdy-looking leather gloves and a red leather outfit overlaid by a pristine white vest and pants to match. In his trail was his timid-looking sister, with a similar outfit save for the blue leather and a short skirt. She clutched a gnarled staff in both hands, as if to hide behind it when they lined up to stand before the adventurers. The dark-skinned elf children were crowned in golden hair, with glimmering mismatched eyes, emerald and sapphire in hue. The trio seemed each a manifestation of physical perfection, drawing various reactions from the contingent that had come to assemble before them. After the adventurers in the rear finally caught up, the boy standing in the middle stepped forward to speak. "All right," he said in a cheerful voice. "Good job making it out here. Welcome to the adventurer's tomb, Tilda." The boy threw his hands up excitedly into the air, as if his announcement should be received to great fanfare. The adventurers simply stared. I really don't think that's a good name," his sister said off to the side. "Huh?" The boy rounded on his sibling with an annoyed look. "It's for training adventurers, and it's a tomb. What's wrong with that?" "But it sounds like they're just coming here to die," she tearfully protested. The boy laughed, his light voice carrying over the wind. "It's not like they'll be dying all the time." He waved his hand dismissively beside his head as he turned back to the others. "The adventurers of the Sorceress Kingdom couldn't be that weak." With the voice of his cowed sister going yoo-yoo in the background, the boy cleared his throat before speaking again, slowly turning his gaze over the men and women of the new Adventurer Guild. "Anyways, now that you're all here, let's..." His voice stopped as he turned his eyes to something that caused him to frown slightly. Itzal followed his line of sight. The annoying noblewoman was looking down suspiciously at a broken pillar covered in vines. When she leaned slightly closer to inspect it, there was a barely discernible flicking motion from one of the plants. The noblewoman blinked once with a blank look on her face before keeling over. There was a shimmer in the air as the girl in the black gown appeared to receive the falling noblewoman. She must have been standing at least 30 meters away. How did she get there so quickly? Cure poison. Kneeling on the grass, she cast a spell, resting the noblewoman's head on her lap. She looked up towards the dark elf siblings with a displeased expression. "Mayor, could you not break my things immediately after I lend them to you?" "Awawa." The girl in the skirt fretted, looking nervously about. The first girl turned her head to level her crimson gaze on the party's cleric. "And you?" She spoke imperiously. "You are a cleric, are you not? Were you just going to stand there and stare at a poisoned party member until they simply expired?" Their cleric, a young man in his late teens, looked down to his feet with no answer to her reprimand. "Hey you!" Itzal jumped as the boy's voice came up from his side. He had been paying attention to ongoing exchange and did not notice the elf's approach. He turned his head to look down at the boy. The young elf's hands were on his hips and he looked up at him with a miffed expression. "You're the scout for that party, aren't you? It's your job to make sure that things like that don't happen." "What? How is this my fault? Why is this midget of an elf talking down to me? That noble bitch." He struggled to keep a lid on his rising temper, but the act of doing so just seemed to make it worse. "Should we heal her?" Mayor asked quietly. Her brother rubbed his head while he seemed to think on their situation. After a minute, his frown turned upside down and he clapped his hands to gain the attention of the assembled adventurers again. "Time to start our first adventure," he declared in a bright voice. "You've entered the territory of an unknown tribe. One of your negotiators is down, and they're angry at you for trespassing on their territory." "What happened?" The noblewoman finally came to, weakly rising to her feet.
Casualties aren't supposed to move," Mare said timidly, holding her staff towards her.
Vines exploded out of the ground at the noblewoman's feet, rapidly wrapping themselves tightly around her body. She let out something resembling a squeak as the vines covered her from head to toe and she fell back down. "What are you saying, kid?" a gold plate from another party asked. "We're supposed to be training in the tomb, right?" "Huh? But you're already in the tomb?" the elf boy replied. "That's the tomb, isn't it?" The man pointed to the entrance of the ruins. "We're just standing in a bunch of trees." "What kind of crazy thing are you saying?" The elf boy gave the adventurer a look one might have bestowed upon a mental invalid. Any proper tomb would have trees. A rock sailed over tall grass, bouncing off of the adventurer's armor. Another followed, striking a nearby mage in the jaw and sending him sprawling to the ground. "What? Who threw that?" "It came from the edge of the meadow." The adventurers who carried shields raised them warily. Another rock flew in from a slightly different direction and one of their archers retaliated. The arrow disappeared into the grass. There was no indication that it had hit anything. Anyways, like I said, the tribe is angry, so here's your objective. The dark elf's smile turned into a broad grin, but it did not reach his eyes. Survive. Yet another stone, larger than a man's fist, flew out towards the adventurer contingent. It sailed into their midst, clipping an unfortunate druid in the shoulder. She was knocked off of her feet, turning once in midair before the thick grass muffled her landing. I see them. A silver plate ranger called out, 3 ogres, edge of the trees to the west. With a face to their enemy, the more experienced adventurers fell into routines developed from years of their craft. The arrangement of the contingent reorganized itself into a more defensible formation. It can't just be ogres, Moknich said. They'll need a lot more than that to deal with all of us. Moknich stepped to the front of the group, standing closest to the tree line to present himself as the closest target for the ogres. More large stones came hurtling in, but he easily sidestepped them. Something darted out of the tall grass and he shifted his arm slightly to deflect it with his shield. The object broke and its pieces spun repeatedly in the air before landing on the ground. It was an arrow. Seeing that the threat had escalated from rocks clumsily hurled at a distance, he advanced, tracing the flight of the arrow back to its source. A rustle in the grass to the side was the only warning he received before a metal spearhead jabbed out at him. With a curse, he pivoted to evade the gleaming point. When the spear seemingly reached the fullest point of its extension, he swatted it to the side with his longsword and advanced on his new assailant. He had taken perhaps 2 steps when another arrow zipped out and pinged off of the ridge of his helmet. Moknich glanced towards the hidden archer and decided that the crude-looking stone points couldn't penetrate his armor. It was all the time the hidden spear wielder needed, however. In the second it took Moknich to turn his attention back to his closest opponent, it was already gone. Shit, he cursed again before shouting to the others nearby. Goblins probably. At least 2, well there's never just 2. A stone from the tree line hit him square in the back, and he staggered to one knee. A spear lanced out from the grass again towards his face and he barely rolled away in time. The hell, he roared as he straightened to his feet again. What are the rest of you doing? Clear this grass so we can take out this trash. On it. A woman called out, stepping forward with her staff extended. Firebar. She remained motionless, extending her staff out towards the field, but the spell had been cut off. After a moment, the mage lowered her magical focus and pointed at her lips with her free hand. While doing so, an arrow appeared in her shoulder, then another in her thigh. When her shock passed, she cried out with a pained expression, not that anyone could hear her. A nearby adventurer ran out and grabbed her, holding his shield above their heads as they scurried away. She got silenced. Someone recognized the gesture before the mage was attacked. They have a caster out there too. A goblin caster? You're kidding me. Could be a cleric, or a bard. There were several different types of casters that were capable of casting silence, a second-tier spell, or effects similar to it. Spare me the goblin bard. There was loose laughter between the more experienced adventurers. The copper plates scattered around the ruin wore uncomprehending expressions. How could anyone laugh when they were being attacked like this? I think we can take this, Moknich. Blair, a druid from Rainbow, who was leading a different party said. Doesn't look like their equipment is any better than regular stuff. No poison, either. If we can flush them out, we have the advantage. If they thought they had the edge in numbers, they would have tried to overwhelm us with this ambush. Do it, Moknich nodded. The mage, who had just been healed by Blair, popped her head out of the grass. She didn't give herself away this time. Fireball. The mage disappeared into the grass again as soon as she finished casting the spell. A compact sphere of flame shot out and landed in the rough area where the arrows had come from. A torrent of fire whirled out from the point of impact, scorching away the grass covering the area to the west and setting the surrounding field ablaze. We get any? Moknich shouted over the wind. I don't know, I doubt it with the way that they've been moving though. Several arrows whistled in from the north, disappearing in the grass near where the mage had cast her fireball from. Guess that answers that, Moknich said. How many do you have left? Plenty where that came from, the mage replied from where she had crawled off to after casting her spell. All right, clear the field to the north, Moknij told her. We can't go chasing these goblins around without leaving the newbies undefended, but at least we can deny them any cover nearby. The mage unleashed another fireball, and Moknij's mind worked to come up with a decisive advantage. Though the initial surprise of the attack had faded, it was still pretty much a standoff against unknown numbers. Oi, 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 oi. A silver-ranked ranger called out, ogres in the back. They used the smoke from the west field to get in and flank us. There were cries of panic in the rear of the formation as the trio of 3-meter-tall ogres descended on the copper plates. They brandished makeshift clubs formed out of heavy branches, waving them menacingly as they closed distance. Over a dozen adventurers immediately scattered at the intimidating sight, and the ogres roared as they swatted aside the few who stood their ground like stuffed dolls. Several silver and gold-ranked adventurers within range raised their bows, releasing arrows in an effort to slow down the rampaging ogres. The arrows that should have made their marks stopped in midair, a hand's breadth away from their targets, before falling harmlessly to the ground. The ogres are warded from arrows. Casters again? Moknij growled. The safest method of dealing with physically powerful opponents like ogres was to take them down from range. It was a common tactic, but Moknij had never before seen ogres counter it with protection from arrows before. The result was that it turned the normally manageable ogres into a much riskier adversary, full of unknowns stemming from the existence of support magic from the unseen casters. Get in there and protect the newbies. He barked out to the surrounding adventurers. We don't know what we're fighting, and this is becoming too chaotic. We need to withdraw and regroup. Even as he called the retreat, the next gust of wind blanketed them in thick smoke. Moknij and what was formerly the entire front line of veteran adventurers could barely see in front of them through the stinging screen. As he blindly stepped forward, coughing and squeezing the tears from his eyes, he kicked something soft that responded with an angry, muffled noise. Looking at his feet, he saw the woman, still covered in vines, who had set off the entire sequence of events. With a long-suffering sigh, Moknij tossed her over his shoulder and trudged off towards the chaos in the rear. By the time he made his way out of the blanket of smoke, the formation of adventurers had collapsed entirely. The copper plates had continued fleeing after they had been scattered by the ogre assault, and were now all over the field running towards Eranthal. Exhausted from their hour-long run to the meeting spot, they were not fast enough to outpace the hidden archers harrying them along the way. They fell one after another as goblin arrows found their targets. The iron plates, who should have been able to handily stand up to the three ogres with even odds, seemed to have been beaten down one at a time. With the lower-ranked adventurers out of the fight, the veterans shifted their focus from attempting to protect their scattered charges to dealing with their ambushes. The gold-ranked fighter was at the front of the vanguard, advancing with his greatsword in an aggressive high guard. A silver-ranked ranger shadowed him, waiting for an opportune moment to strike in melee. The fighter blocked the massive overhead swing of the first ogre using Fortress. As it reeled from the block, which would have felt like striking a stone wall, he released the defensive martial art and shifted to offense. He roared, advancing to deliver a massive blow to the still recovering ogre. Slur. A volley of brilliant light streamed out of the grass towards the fighter. Moknij instantly recognized them as projectiles from the magic arrow spell. There were two sources, each 2 salvos of 3 arrows, meaning that there were at least 2 Tier 3 casters hiding in the grass. The 12 flaring projectiles were unerring. The fighter groaned and collapsed in the direction of his momentum. The ranger, caught off guard by the unexpected loss as he tried to flank one of the ogres, was himself flanked and summarily pounded into the grass. All that remained were the veterans who were returning from the front line. There was Rainbow, Moknij's regular mithril rank team, the platinum rank mage, and a gold rank bard. Their adversary consisted of the 3 ogres, probably 3 casters, 2 who were at least tier 3, whatever it was that kept harassing him with the spear, and at least 2 archers. By his estimation, the remaining adventurers should still easily come out on top. The magic casters could still cause things to go awry, so he slowed down and went wide around the tall grass that they appeared to be depending on for concealment. Purposely stalking in a circle, he joined up with his partner Jocelyn, a mithril-ranked monk who could act flexibly as either a vanguard or makeshift defender, depending on what the situation warranted. "You still good to go?" Moknij asked him. "Not a scratch," Jocelyn replied. Moknij nodded. They were in good shape for a brawl if it came down to it, and time was on their side. He made a challenging gesture at the trio of ogres still standing in range of the grass, but they only mocked him in response. That was strange. Ogres usually gleefully entered battle heedless of risk if they felt that they had the advantage. Well, he supposed that they didn't, but they shouldn't have been able to puzzle that out from numbers alone. He turned to the mage, fishing around his memory for her name. Ilma. It's Ilan, she scowled. Ah, right, Moknij said apologetically. Do you have anything that can whittle those guys down? They seem to have a lot of magical support. I have about half of my mana left, Ilan replied. I can't tell what other enchantments they have on them, though. Shouldn't I just fireball them if they're all standing together like that? They already know you have fireball, he told her, so these casters might have already guarded against it. Just put some hurt on them, maybe those ogres will finally get mad enough to charge beyond the range of their support. Righto. Ilan edged forward into range. The ogres stood their ground, meaning that they were probably standing between their casters and the adventurers. They couldn't open the way to them, but their own casters would have to come forward out of the grass to retaliate against her magic arrow. She sent out the first tier spell, and they awaited the results. 3 bolts of dazzling light flew out of her hands, striking the leftmost ogre. It grinned back at her. That didn't look like it did damage. Moknij examined the result. More magical protection? Nah, Ilan replied, that definitely stung. He's putting up an act. Magic arrow. The wizard delivered another salvo of magical bolts, striking the same ogre. This time, a pair of arrows were launched out of the grass towards the city. They both stopped before sinking into her flesh, dropping impotently to the ground. Ha! Ilan grinned, you're not the only ones that can do that. The arrows kept coming, even as she launched a third salvo of magical bolts into the same ogre. Then, something odd happened. First one stream of arrows stopped, then the other. Not a single individual on the field missed that. Ah crap, Moknij said. Time's up, let's go. He dashed forward together with Jocelyn, rapidly closing the distance to the ogres and riveting their attention on them. There was a strain of discordant notes in the air and he felt himself being filled with a sense of courage and power. Twin magic, haste. Ilan layered an additional enchantment on the 2 charging adventurers, augmenting the rapidity of their movement and attacks. Moknij catapulted forward at a tremendous speed, like a bolt loosed from a ballista. If this was the case. Ability boost. With all the magic that had been piled on him, even his regular attacks would be quite potent. Attacks with martial arts would be absurdly so. He aimed for the ogre in the middle, who appeared to be preparing for the charge with an attack of its own. It didn't matter to Moknij, though. Invulnerable fortress. The heavy branch came down on him to no more effect than a feather. Moknij hurtled forward, driving his shoulder into the middle ogre's abdomen with the full force of his charge. It flew tens of meters through the air, tumbling away end over end after it landed, leaving a long trail of disturbed grass. Perfectly stable with his defensive art active, Moknij pivoted, bringing the full force of his upper body down at the next ogre. The blade of the long sword traced a shimmering arc overhead. Fortress. The ogre gave him a smug look as it parried Moknij's devastating overhead strike. Well, I guess that explains a lot. 3 ogres usually could not stand against so many adventurers, but, like human warriors, they could grow in experience, strength and skill as well. Ogre berserkers, he called out. You don't say? Jocelyn replied sardonically. Unlike Moknij, Jocelyn had finished off the left ogre, amongst relentless flurry of strikes cared little for a few seconds of enhanced defense. Augmented by magic as he was, the lean brawler remained completely unscathed. It was 2 versus 1 now, and Moknij wanted to finish things before it might change again. His sword had gotten stuck in the thick branch, proof that he had attacked with such force it nearly overwhelmed the augmented parry, which the ogre stubbornly refused to relinquish. Well, that was fine by him. Hey Jocelyn, he said, weapons stuck. Let's finish this guy. Oh. Moknij's call for assistance was needless, as the bard appeared behind the ogre berserker and casually slashed out the giant demi-human's knees from behind with his rapier.